So we're going to talk about F1 today.
We
Um,
are. Yeah.
I usually know a lot about, well, not a lot. I mean, the whole point of doing this is that I don't know a lot about things, but I usually
Mm.
know a bit more than nothing about particular sports, right? And so this one, though, I feel like there's going to be a lot of questions. I didn't know that at all. So, hi everyone. Today I have with me Dimitri. We met only last September. We were in the same section and also the same team for the first 10 months of the MBA or so. Um, and so in getting to know Dimitri, one of the things he talked about very early on in our communication course was his love for F1. So I knew that I wanted to have him on the show and get his input and his expertise in the topic. And so let's see where we go from here. So Dimitri, I know a little bit about you from the time we've spent together, but maybe you could introduce yourself to our
Sure.
listeners today.
Sure. Hi, I'm Dimitri. As Sam said, I started the MBA at the same time. I'm brought up in the UK, but my parents are French and Greek. And yeah, I gave one of our our first courses at the degree was about getting better at giving speeches and discussions, and I gave one specifically on F1, and the point of it was trying to convince people. Now, I listened to it again a couple of days ago because it popped up on my recording. I was like, I'll have a listen to this and see what it's like. Oh, I liked it a lot more at the time. Listening to it again, there's definitely bits about it which I'm not so keen on. But the whole point of it was just trying to tell people why I think it's the best sport and better than other sports, and what I think is so interesting about it. So I guess this is just kind of an expansion on that. And yeah, I think it's great that you don't know anything, not too much about it, and I'm sure we'll make mistakes on how we describe it and how we talk about it, but it doesn't really matter.
So I guess let's start with the fundamental question: what exactly is F1?
It's gained a lot of popularity in the last 4 or 5 years, so I think a lot of people will probably know now. But it's a motorsport. It's what some people could describe as the pinnacle of motorsport. I think that's arguable, but it's a sport with a lot of people spending a lot of money driving around in circles. As a sort of basis of what it is, it's kind of halfway between a standard sport and a sort of hackathon. So like it's a year-long hackathon where the teams are thousands of people have to build these cars to very specific sets of specifications. In the meantime, the drivers and their small core team every couple of weeks have to try to drive those cars at lots of different types of circuits and get the most out of them.
Mm.
And as the season goes on, you get different tracks. And as the season goes on, the sort of technical hackathon team starts developing things as well. So it creates a lot of different shifts, both in terms of every weekend you get something interesting to watch, but also over the space of the year or even multiple years, it develops itself within the teams themselves. So it's kind of nice and different in terms of other sports that it's not just about the player or just about the people on the pitch. It's
Mhm.
also about the thousand or so people behind there.
That is interesting. I have never heard anybody can like talk about F1 and the word hackathon in the same sentence. So I mean, yeah, we're already getting super good information. Okay. So all right. So there's this long duration of putting together this car, right? So it's like ultimate mechanics, ultimate physics, like
Yeah.
all that, right? They put together the car and then what happens? Is it like I know that F1 happens in many cities around the world throughout the cycle of
Yeah.
I guess the competition, but is it like a cumulative process or is every race its own entity?
Both, I guess.
Okay.
So it's what's called a world championship. That's how they describe it. And there are two world championships each year.
Okay.
Um, each championship is made up of Grand Prix or races, as you call them in English, because Formula One is a sport that's sort of defined by French, but raced by English people traditionally. So a lot of the words tend to be a mix of English and French. So each Grand Prix is just each race every week. There used to be about 12, 13, 14 races a year. This year, I think, is the longest ever, and it's 24. So pretty much one every 2 weeks, or they'll take a break and do a couple stacked together. And to win the championships, you either get the most points for the team, or you get the most points for the driver. And those are the two championships. They're called the drivers' championships or the constructors' championships. Each team is made up of two drivers, so you can accumulate those points together for the team. But separately, the driver also wants to win the most points for themselves to win the drivers' championship.
Mm-hmm.
Typically, the one that people care about is the drivers' championships because it's a bit more emotional to care about a driver than for a team. But the teams care about the team or the constructors' championships because that's where you make the money.
Okay.
The higher up you are in the ranking of that, you're making tens, if not 50 million more in terms of prize money. So any point you can get as a team makes a significant chunk
Mm.
in terms of how much you can develop the car for next year and so on and so forth.
Oh, I didn't know that at all. Like,
Yep.
I really did not. I thought it was just like, about the driver, but it makes sense if it's so much about the car, because from the little that I've watched, I know that the car, the tires, and the speed of the team at the what do you call it? Like when they drive in to fix things before they go
The
back
pit
out.
lane, the
Yeah,
pit lane.
that,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Like the speed that happens in the pit lane is
yeah,
is just as important, to get back out there and to get everything working. Okay, so two championships,
yeah,
more or less throughout the year. What are
yeah.
some of the main governing rules? In terms, like you talked about points and things like that. How
Sure,
how are those things measured and scored, I guess?
sure. I think actually, can I answer your previous question? Because I realized I didn't actually answer it completely.
Oh, sure.
So, because you said what happens on an actual race, I don't think I said that. I just said that there were two championships, and I
Yeah.
think it's also important before we get into the rules to understand like what happens every weekend or every time or a Grand Prix happens.
Yeah.
It's over 4 days: Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and it's a mix of practice, qualifying, and racing. It's quite a
Okay.
standard way of going about in motorsport that you have the practice because what you don't know a lot about motorsport and what I didn't know when I got into it is that actually setting up the car and the way you define the car specific for that track is 90% of the race win.
Mm,
So spending a lot of time making sure, and it's so when they say setup, it's things like how stiff are your brakes, how much of your brake goes to the front, how much goes to the back, how stiff is your suspension, what kind of shapes of aerodynamics you put on the car, all these things that make small changes, but it's like 100,000 things. So when you add them up, they make a significant difference.
mhm.
And when you'll hear drivers complaining a lot of the times, it's because they feel they haven't set up the car properly.
Okay.
And that's a big chunk of what the racing actually is, because once you get to qualifying and racing, then it's just up to the driver effectively. The teams work mostly on that setup period. That's the Thursday and Friday, and typically on Saturday you'll have the qualifying, and on Sunday you'll have the race, which I mean you can see online. It's you start in a grid format, you race around, and the whole point of it is to try to get to the end in the shortest time possible. And that's where the tires come in, but we can get that a little bit later. Just to give an overview of that's what happens on a weekly basis.
Okay.
Now, the things that define that are what you mentioned, the rules, right? They kind of frame this whole thing and define it. Again, there's two sets of rules. There's one set of rules for the sort of staff that create the car, and there's one set of rules for the set of staff that race the car. They're called the sporting regulations and the technical regulations. Sporting is
Okay.
for the racing, and technical is for the technical bits. They're big. They're like chunky booklets, and they're really specific. Um, so formula comes from the French formule, which means like a set or like a dictation or like a suggestion on how you should build a car. There's other motorsport series, like IndyCar is another one, the second biggest one. That one doesn't really have a formula. It has set cars. It says this is the car you're driving. You have some tweaks, but pretty much you drive this. So
Mm,
most of the work goes in with the driver and the setup of the car. Formula One is different, and that's why it's called Formula, because it's based on a set of regulations, and so the teams aren't just racing, they're building the cars from scratch. And that doesn't happen in many other series. That's what kind of makes it a lot more interesting, at least from my perspective, than the other ones. So, the technical regulations are like this thick block that define like the most minute small things in the world. Like they will say the angle of the wing on the front right wing next to the wheel can only be 3.5 millimeters wide and not have an angle displacing it. The bottom of the car has to have no break in the line of this specific angle at this height. Like it's really, really narrow because it's built up over the years where every year or every 2 years, the technical regulations will be renewed, even sometimes every 6 months. And the teams will do their utmost to find a loophole because as soon as they find a loophole, they find an advantage. And so
Mm-hmm.
over the years, they've gone from, 5 or 6 pieces of paper to like, I mean, this huge, extremely specific notebook because the teams have hundreds of people working on trying to find ways around them and ways to sort of develop a car the best way possible. So even though they're very specific, you'll get like in 2022 when the new regulations came in, the cars that showed up all looked quite different, even though the regulations are so extremely specific, because they do leave some room for interpretation on purpose.
Okay.
Historically, there has been some times where it hasn't really worked out and it's kicked back. There's lots of things sometimes when, Formula One will be like, oh, this is where we want the cars to go, so we'll set the regulations in this direction, and then it goes in a completely other direction, or someone finds some loophole and it ruins the racing. I'm doing air quotes here. That's the technical side, and then the sporting side is what you think of as fairness, effectively. So if anything is unfair or unsafe, that's where those rules come in, and those are the ones that will typically affect a bit more the weekend stuff. So those will be the flags that you see waving, the red, yellow, blue, and the other colored flags that you might see waving. There will be the penalties. There's penalty systems like in any other sport, except you typically don't see many people disqualified. The penalties tend to be more based on time. So you'll lose 5 seconds or 10 seconds, or there'll be some other kind of thing. Or it'll be a safety thing. And then typically, if it's a safety thing, you'll mostly get disqualified or something like that will end up happening.
Okay.
Yeah, is that clear?
Yes, it is clear.
Okay,
I was just sitting here thinking maybe I should have gone into like motorsports after my physics degree. Um, instead of I
yeah,
mean
I
I
thought the
can't say
same.
instead of because I didn't really do anything with my physics degree. But anyway, at least now I could understand what you're talking about. So I get it. I get
Yeah,
it. I
I
hope
mean, I had the
viewers
same. Yeah,
understand.
because I studied my degree and I didn't really know about it, and I came out of it. I've got a friend who went into it, but it's very competitive. It is historically very full of angry men. That tends to be the vibe, and it's not necessarily a very open place to be. And it also is very specific, quite a hard place to get into because it's if you know the right people, if you happen to be born in the right town in Italy, that kind of things. So I thought about it as well, but I've also seen people who've come in and come out and been happy to leave. So
Okay.
there's lots of ways, but yeah,
So your comment will divert us for a little bit from my next
fantastic.
question, but let's jump then and we'll come back to my other question. So maybe let's talk a little bit about diversity in F1.
Sure.
And I when I say diversity, I mean both gender, nationality, what people look like. And I say this
Yeah.
because um I'm a Caribbean person, right? I'm
Hmm.
also a woman. I do know that Lewis Hamilton in particular, when he started racing
Hmm.
professionally, I guess he was racing for a long time before we knew who he was. But when he got into it, I saw an uptick in like Caribbean people, or I guess people
Yep.
that looked like Lewis, starting to look at the sport a lot more. I know that like my partner, for example, he had been a Formula One and F1 fan for a while, and I only started looking when I realized, oh, there's this guy with Caribbean roots
Hmm.
who's racing. So maybe you could tell us about a bit about what you've seen in terms of gender diversity changing or needing to change, and also other representation overall. Like, what can you say about that from your experience?
Yes. It's not good. It's not good news. I can't lie to you. Formula One up until So there's a lot of things. I think we could do a whole podcast on the ethics of Formula One, and I think this would probably fall underneath it.
Hmm.
They have a lot of problems. It's getting better, but I mean, nowhere near the speed it should have, or in a lot of ways, yeah, should have done in the past. So if we speak about diversity specifically, there's a lot of barriers to entry for anyone to get into the sport, and any minority. When I say minority, I mean relative to this sport, so people who were not traditionally able to get into the sport. Because first things first, it's a very extremely expensive sport that tends to be only available to people who can fund themselves. So Formula 3, Formula 4, and Formula 2, which are the sort of series that get you into there, most of the time you don't get paid, which means you have to kind of fund yourself or find some kind of sponsorship, which makes it already before we even get into the diversity side of things, it's already an extremely niche thing that only a certain amount of people can even think about doing. Lewis and a couple of other drivers on the grid have done fantastically well in the way that they've been able to break into the sport without having that background. And I think that's something that's happened more now than it has before. But there's still, 4, 5, 6 drivers on the grid who pretty much, maybe not 6, but a good 5 who paid their way there. Now, it doesn't mean that they're not good, they're fantastic, but we're talking like the top 20 drivers in the world. There's probably hundreds of people who could get there who wouldn't have been able to go there just because they didn't have the means to do so. I mean, there's
Yeah.
literally a driver whose dad bought the team so he could drive it. It's that kind of level of thing still exists in this sport, even though we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of millions. Lewis did great, and I think it's worth going out and reading some of the interviews he did because he had a lot of pushback when he joined the sport. There's a lot of racist people out there, particularly in sports, and he had it all throughout his career from when he was young, not just professionally, but also when he came in afterwards. It still existed even afterwards, and probably does to a certain extent, but isn't as visible as it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of other representation, uh, I mean, if I go for the sort of world representation, it's not bad in Formula One actually. They're getting better at it. There's definitely more people from the rest of the world, which as opposed to some other sports.
Mm-hmm.
Women, on the other hand, is a completely different issue, and you still see a lot of podcasts and a lot of people talking about women, and the constant conversation is always still focused on this idea of whether they have the ability or not. And you're like, well, okay, like in some kind of maybe that's a question to ask, but is that really the most important question to ask? Like the problem with women is that they've never had the opportunity, right? So start with that, go through that. Let's go through the whole rankings of things, and then maybe in the future, maybe that's questions are worth asking. But it's not really the right focus to go forwards.
Mm-hmm.
They tried. They came up with a series called Formula W. Um, and to try to sort of promote women in sport, it recently closed this year. There have been women in Formula One who have done fantastically well, and not just in Formula One, but in motor racing, as it were. So I think the question of ability already is sidelined before we even get into it. There's Michelle Mouton, and I think there's some YouTube videos that are worth watching on her because she was batshit in the best way possible. I don't know. Can I swear on this podcast?
I don't know. We'll see.
Okay. You can see afterwards. She used to race Group B cars. Group B cars are these cars, rally cars back in the 80s that were obscene. Like they got banned after a couple of years because they were so overpowered and loads of people died. Because it was like you take the smallest car possible, empty it of all the weight, and put the absolute biggest engine you can put in it, and go as fast as you can around dirt tracks in the middle of nowhere with no precautionary measures whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
She did great, and I think she won 1 year, which is already a huge achievement from that perspective, because rallying and Formula One are both these kind of right at the top, extremely difficult sports to do for in terms of motorsport. And there have been some Formula One female racing drivers also, but the sort of the final point where you end up in Formula One isn't a space that has ever promoted women, and on top of that, there's no ladder or way for any women to get into the sport, even if you were to be able to get to the end. So no, there isn't really any. As I said, there was Formula W, but it wasn't. I mean, in a sense, it was a nice idea and a nice direction because it helped promote and give this ladder to women, but it wasn't quite well integrated with other things. And the way it was organized and the way they defined the races was a bit weird. It was kind of some racers were cherry picked and put into these positions. It didn't feel like a fair sport. It just felt like a show. And I think that took away from it quite a lot. So, yeah,
So
diversity in Formula One is
lots to be
not there.
done. Okay.
Yeah.
So a lot to be done. Okay. Okay. And is this the same case when it comes to the technical teams? Or is it a bit more open there?
Definitely a lot more open there. Um, that's the upside, and that's where a lot of the teams are putting their focus. So when a lot of what the message that the teams are saying is when they get the pushback saying Formula One isn't diverse, they say, but Formula One is the whole team, not just the drivers. It's the the drivers are 1% of they're 0.1% of the team, right? There's another 9,900 whatever 1,000 people working there. So it's definitely better. I mean, obviously, it's still historically male dominated because it's STEM, right? It's engineering and sciences and technical, and historically that's been more male dominated. But there's definitely much more of a push there because there's a sort of worldwide push as well as a governmental push for these things. And you can tell the teams are trying, which I think is nice because they promote it and they do their best to always highlight a lot of the women's in the sport. For example, on the podium, you'll get the podium is always the top three drivers, and the winner driver gets to also have one person from the team come up with them. And so quite a lot of the teams, particularly Mercedes, I think did quite well last year to always promote one of the women drivers within one of the women technical team within there and highlight their achievements as well.
I think I've seen some. I have seen some of that. Some champagne throwing with women around.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for indulging that segue. But we were talking about the race, the governing body, and stuff, and you touched on
Yes.
something in your explanation there before, where you mentioned F2, F3, and F4.
Right.
Because that
Yeah.
was a question. I didn't know it went to four. I thought it stopped at three. So maybe you could share a little bit about how the levels are
Hmm.
organized. Yeah, and so we could understand like how you get through the ranks if you were becoming an F1 driver, Formula One.
Yeah. Okay. So there's pretty much just one path to get into Formula One. There used to be more because it used to be much less organized, but now there's pretty much one path, which obviously can be accelerated with money. But the general gist of it is you go-karting. For those of you who don't know, go-karting is quite a serious thing. I also didn't realize. I thought it was just a thing you do on the occasional weekend with your friends, but no, there's a lot of very serious go-karting competitions, and they're actually some of the biggest feeder series is to get you into Formula One and any racing driving. Typically, people start on go-karting
Oh,
because you don't need a license to go go-karting. Uh, you don't need a license to do a lot of driving, to be fair, but you can start when you're like 4 or 6, and you can go around and do go-karts. So that tends to be the way people start, and then they'll go to the British go-karting championships or whatever they are in their country, get to the top of there, and then they get some choices. There's a lot of different motorsport directions you can go into. Most people want to go to Formula One because it's kind of the one that people see. But people, for example, in France or in Finland or some of the Nordics might want to go to rally racing or some of these other directions. But go-karting tends to be for this circuit racing direction. Then, as of I don't know 5 or 6 years ago, there is now a very clear path of Formula 4, Formula 3, Formula 2, Formula 1, all of which are run and organized by the FIA, which is this governing body for the rules of sport. It's Fédération Internationale d'Autosport, I guess. It's French, as I mentioned earlier, and
we'll put
they
it
define.
in a caption somewhere.
Sure,
Yeah.
exactly, yeah. Also FIA if you want, but they define the rules for a lot of for most motorsports that are sort of generally world recognized.
Mhm.
They define the rules. So it would be FIFA for the football equivalent, which is also a French word actually, but maybe Swiss. Anyway, so yeah, there's now F4, F3, F2, and F1. It used to be they had different names, all the different directions. Obviously, most people don't end up in F1. I mean, F2, obviously it's like a pyramid, right? So if there's 30 people in F4, actually there's way more in F4. The thing is that in F4, there's also many different types of F4 because you have European F4 and this F4 and that F4. So there's thousands of people in F4, hundreds of people in F2, tens of people, no, so hundreds of people in F3, tens of people in F2, and they're all trying to get to F1, where, Lewis Hamilton has been in F1 for 50, what is it, since 2008, 2007?
Wow.
So nearly 20 years. So obviously, if there's 20 people in F2, they're not going to make it to F1 because most of the seats are booked.
Yeah.
And the teams are not going to take a brand new driver because the brand new drivers are not very helpful. They tend to crash a lot, which is really expensive. They don't know the tracks as well and they don't race as well. And on top of that, they don't give you very good feedback on how to tune and set up the car. So a new driver is really a big risk. Um, but that's kind of the funnel that exists, and obviously most people end up, either becoming like everything, like any sport, right? They end up becoming teaching other people to do the sport, or they go inside side things on top of the sport, or they'll go to other racing series like Dutch touring car, British touring car,
Okay.
WEC, which is another big one. You can look
What
those
does
up
that
if you're
stand for?
interested. World Endurance Championship. The crowning race is the Le Mans 24 Hours, which is a famous race in the world for being 24 hours in the dark. Well, obviously in the dark and the light.
Yes.
Yeah. I can tell you more about the feeder series if you want, but the one difference actually I will mention is that they're not formulas in the traditional sense. They're more like stock racing series. So most of the cars are the same.
Okay.
So it's more about analyzing the drivers necessarily rather than analyzing the teams.
Okay.
So that's
This
kind
is
of what
the
it's
this is the other one, the
the F2, F3,
WEC, the F.
F4.
Oh,
No,
okay,
sorry.
okay,
Those
okay.
are
So
most of the cars tend to be the same. There's obviously better teams and worse teams and bigger teams and smaller teams,
yeah,
but the cars are 90% the same car.
okay, makes sense,
Yeah.
I guess. And if they have to like even it all. Um,
Yeah.
so if it's so difficult to get a spot in F1, how does the like when let's say Lewis Hamilton um or he's the only full name that I know. I know
Sure. Yeah.
like there are people that know all the drivers, but I'm sorry, I only know about Lewis. Um, so let's say Lewis retires,
Yeah.
someone has to take his place, right? So if newer drivers don't get the opportunity, how do they transition nicely?
This is some of the best parts of the year. This is what's called silly season. It's great. So this like if you think about Formula One in terms of there's lots of different parts of the sport that you can like. You can like the drivers, you can be a super fan of the team, you can like the technical side, you can be into it for whatever. The driver side of things, on top of the fact that it's fun to see, how well they're doing every weekend, and you might love a specific driver. This sort of political games on how which driver goes where and how they feel and when they change teams is great fun to watch. Over the last couple of weeks, Daniel Ricciardo, who was a really big driver 4 or 5 years ago, stayed around the sport but kind of got switched to the wrong team, didn't do so well, then got kicked out of the sport. He's now coming back, and that's a whole big thing that people are very excited about. Let's say Lewis leaves, right? This is a big drop, and he probably will because he's 38, and you might, at least in the next 5 years, he's probably not going to be in the sport anymore. At least not as a driver. Well, then you have one of the top three, four teams is missing a star driver. Depends on how their team is balanced. His teammate currently is a sort of young upstart, very strong, very less stable, very level-headed, which tends to be the flavor of Mercedes. That tends to be what they go for. Um, but by the time Lewis leaves, he'll probably be relatively veteran, like he'll have been in the sport 6 years or so. So
Mhm.
they can take the risk. They can take the risk to get a new startup because if you get a new guy, then you get to build him up and he gets to stay in your team.
Okay.
An older guy will be more likely to switch around depending on which cars he thinks he's likely to get. But typically, what you get is a domino effect. So Lewis will leave, somebody else, let's say Carlos Sainz or another driver, will go to his spot, and his spot will be free. Then somebody else will go to his spot, and sometimes you'll get
Mhm.
5 or 6 teams switching just because one person left,
Okay.
and
Okay.
that's kind
So
of the way it goes.
drivers aren't necessarily tied to teams in a way where they just prefer to stick with a team and then like if Lewis leaves this Carlos guy, does he drive for somebody else or does he drive for Mercedes
Yeah, he does.
for somebody else? Okay, so
Yeah,
it's a bit more fluid, I guess, in terms of who is the driver for the and who is the car, maybe. How would you
yeah. I
just
mean, and so the teams will have their own drivers that they support all the way throughout Formula 3, Formula 2, Formula 1. And the idea is to support them to make sure that they get to Formula 1. Red Bull is notorious for this.
yeah.
They have a lot of drivers, and all these drivers go through what's called the meat grinder because Red Bull is a very ruthless organization. In the last 4 years, they've kicked out, I think, 3 drivers halfway through the season. So you're driving for the team, and they'll kick you out while you're literally driving the car. One week you're driving, the next week you're out of the team. They'll do this very often, and they just keep rotating people until they get the right one. That's the way they sort of work. So
Mhm.
they'll have lots of drivers through these feeder series to enable them to sort of rotate things around. Alternatively, you have teams more like Mercedes with Lewis. Lewis has only ever driven for a Mercedes engined or a Mercedes-driven car. He drove for McLaren before, but it was a collaboration between McLaren and Mercedes. So he's much more loyal from that perspective. So I don't think he would ever go to another team because the team was built around him and with him, and the reason he won 7 world championships was mostly due to the fact that him and the team were so well meshed together. Max Verstappen with Red Bull is another example, or Schumacher with Ferrari back in the 2000s. Though that kind of relationships do tend to bloom because they're big teams that need to sort of win a lot of points, and they tend to mesh very well together with drivers, and that works very well. But you also have a lot of people who tend to be a bit more flexible and just try to do the best they can with what they've got.
Okay. Okay. Understood. So, what about some of the, I guess, the rules or tactics, I should say, maybe like in the race, right? You mentioned earlier that tires are important, but
Mm.
what are some of the things, the drivers that some of the things that they would employ to use so that they win the game? There's tackling in football,
Mm.
there's, whatever types of things you do in cricket. I don't know, catch the ball, right, in cricket. And so,
Yeah, yeah, that tactic catching.
yes,
Yeah, yeah.
what are some of what are some of those rules or some of those game plays,
Yeah.
if you would call it that, in Formula One?
So you're right. Yeah, the tires are the main strategy or tactic that tends to play out on a race day. What's worth thinking about is that the drivers are extremely precise. They've raced around these tracks, whether in the simulator or in real life, hundreds and thousands of times. So you can tell them, race at 90%, race at 80%, race at 85% and save fuel, race at 87% and save tires, and they can do that to the millisecond.
Mhm.
So they're very much able to understand how they are compared to the rest of the pack, and how they can sort of manage themselves. It's worth bearing in mind that in Formula One, it's always relative. And whatever you do is relative to you, the track, and everybody else on that specific weekend. So whatever you're trying to do, you're only trying to maximize what you can do based on other people. Bearing that in mind, the only goal of a Formula One racer is to get through the race, through the allotted amount of kilometers or the allotted amount of laps in the shortest amount of time possible. They're effectively just racing themselves. The problem is there's a lot of other people in the way that tend to either put their car in the way, or in some other way kind of just make your life difficult. The way they do that typically is with tires. So you have typical different types of tires that will wear down at different rates, and that creates sort of strategies of speed strategies. So if you have a tire that degrades very quickly, you'll be very fast initially but slow down, and then you'll pit, and somebody else will have a tire that degrades slower, and they'll be more even all the way along.
Okay.
And what that ends up meaning is the position on the track tends to be more important than necessarily how fast you're going, because if you're ahead of someone, you can block and get in their way. So the two things that play into them, the two main tactics are the fact that one, your tires degrade at a different speed than somebody, and two, if you're ahead of them, you can defend. And with
Okay.
that, you can kind of gauge the most of the strategies that happen on the weekend. Um, the rest is mostly due to setup and how they organize the cars, and occasionally you'll see some sort of other weird strategy that's a bit sort of unfair, but most of the time it tends to just be around how you organize yourself and how you pace yourself compared to everybody else.
And so, like, you want to get in front, like Mario Kart, so you could send the shell, right,
Yep.
back
Yep.
to everybody.
Yeah, yeah. And that also depends per circuit, and like there's other sides of it. But
Okay.
in a sense, the actual racing itself per weekend is not as complicated as necessarily everything else that happens. As long once you've understood the tires, that tends to be the biggest thing that people tend to talk about on a weekend. Yeah, that's about it.
Okay. Cool. Thank you. Something that we've been hearing, as you're talking, right? We hear both car manufacturers like Mercedes, right,
Yeah,
like McLaren, um but we also hear brands like Red Bull.
yeah,
We didn't say anybody else, but I know that there's like Petronas, right? Because I mean, there
yeah.
are these different brands, and then these are the car manufacturers. So, and when you look at a Formula One car, you see it's very well decorated with
It
many
is. Yeah.
different symbols. So, how does that play into I guess the team, the sport itself. How do those partnerships either, I guess, benefit the game? How did that evolve? It's a hyphenated team name, as far as I understand. It's
It
usually a
is, yes.
car and a brand
Hmm.
together, right? See, I know something.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so maybe you could tell us a little bit about that aspect of the sport.
It's a big part of it, and it has been forever. I think the best example is Marlboro and Ferrari. So, the Ferrari brand for all of the 80s. Oh no, actually, McLaren had it. Regardless, Marlboro, the cigarettes.
Hmm.
If you look at any historical Formula One car, they will be there. They're all hugely sponsored by cigarettes because it was like a dangerous sport for cool people who smoked, right? That was the vibe that they were selling. Um, So, and that was so ingrained within Ferrari that when they banned it, you can have a look. It's good fun to watch. They came up with all of these weird tactics to keep the brand on the car, whilst not technically having the brand on the car. To the literally up until the 2015s when they came up with a new brand to support, which like this brand called Mission Win Now. And you went on their website and it was a like a useless website that didn't tell you anything, but that was sponsored by Philip Morris and kind of related you back to the thing. And you're like, what the hell? Like, this is such a tenuous link. But they just tried so hard to keep this image attached. And they'll do things like, the Ferrari logo was put with a diagonal red line because that reminds you of the diagonal on the Marlboro packet,
Yeah.
right? So that those kinds of things were hugely popular. And the Formula One and branding is extremely intertwined just in the way that they sort of promote themselves. I think a lot of it has to become with the fact that it's such an expensive sport. And up until, I mean, there were periods where a lot of money was made, but even up until 6, 7 years ago, a lot of the teams were coming in and losing money. It's only now, recently, in the last couple of years, that teams have really started making a lot of money. The example is that there was a team sold in 2009 for like $1, something like that, because it was so much effort to kickstart the team.
Yeah.
So there's always been a lot of sponsor branding, and it tends to be the way that teams kind of that people kind of break into the sport is through their sponsors. So Red Bull is one of them. They've been in the sport since the late 1990s, but for the first 5 or 6 years, they were just a sponsor.
Okay.
Then the head, Dietrich Mateschitz, was a bit of a crazy guy, just went, let's buy a Formula One team, and then took this guy from Formula Two, went, you're the team principal, do it, go crazy. Formula One needs a bit of a shake up. We're going to be the shake uppers. And they came in and they bought one team, and then within 3, 4 years, they bought another team, which is crazy stuff to do. Only if you have lots of money and a lot of bad decisions would you buy two Formula One teams in the space of 5 years. But it's worked out great. I mean, they've done super well and made a lot of money. So I don't really know how. I don't understand it in terms of the overarching perspective, but I know that it's very ingrained in it. I think as with a lot of sports,
Hmm.
there's definitely good sides to it, but there's also parts of it which ideally weren't there. And I think it's always interesting to see how each different team does their sponsorship. Mercedes, as with their traditional sort of mindset, is more stable and calm, and they're sponsored by a big chemical manufacturer, Ineos or Petronas equally, right? And they get the stable amount of money every year, and they support it, and that's it. McLaren is now managed by Zach Brown, which is a guy worth looking up because he's been very interesting in terms of branding and marketing. If you're interested in that,
Hmm.
he's done the opposite. He goes with as many different sponsors as possible in lots of different ways, to the extent where they literally had for a couple of races this year, a tablet on the inside their car. Like, I don't know how else to describe it other than if you think of the shell of the car is made
Yeah.
out of carbon fiber, there was a hole in that shell, and in that was like a Kindle tablet, like an e-ink tablet,
Hmm.
where you could see one sponsor, and then halfway through the race, it would just switch sponsors. So your cars would have multiple sponsors, like that you would keep seeing new sponsors every time.
Yeah.
And that was his way of making money because that's his approach.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting to see how each different one does it because it also tells you the flavor and the way that the team defines itself, which kind of links in as well to their branding.
Wow, that is very interesting, and it also kind of gives me the feeling that these teams are more, like an entity more than just a technical team behind a
Yeah.
driver. It has its own personality. It has its own their own vibe, I guess. like
Yep,
like it's
100%.
an individual entity by itself. Okay. All right, Dimitri. So yeah, so that is all very interesting, right? We looked at all these different aspects of how the game becomes. I mean, should I say game or should I say sport?
As you like. I think it's both.
Okay, maybe I'll say sport because I feel like it's a
Okay.
little different in
I mean, I
my
think some people would
view.
get offended if you said game, but I think that I don't think there's much difference.
Okay,
So I mean, people would have said video games are just games 20 years ago, but now they're bigger than any sport
it's
out there. So
sports.
it
Yeah,
really depends how you define
yeah,
it. Yeah.
yeah. No, no, that's fair. That's fair. Um, Okay, and then in terms of this sport or this game, in some more traditional team sports, we have seen like an evolution happening, right? So, for example, there's like regular traditional football, but we also see that PK just started, a new type of league, a kind of small, faster league. In cricket, we went from Test cricket, which is 4 days long, and now we have like T20 cricket. In
Right.
golf, we went from the traditional golf game, and then the LIV came around, and that was a
Right.
whole thing.
Yes.
So, have you seen any type of alternative version to the traditional Formula One, or do you think in the future there may be variations? Or do you think because of the way that the sport is by itself, it's already dynamic enough where it doesn't need to change? What do you see in the future of
Mm.
F1?
Right. It's a good question. I think it's a nice way of comparing it to the other sports. Um, I think I'll answer it in two ways again. So first things first, Formula One is much more dynamic than other sports because of the fact that the teams are constantly developing. It is by its very nature adaptive. Like that's the whole point of it. If you don't adapt, it just dies.
Mhm,
They have to change the rules in the cars every year. So, for example, they introduced new types of engines in 2016 with hybrid technology, and they've tried to change things up a lot. And particularly since Liberty, who is the new owners of Formula One, took over, they have really tried their best to change things up as much as possible in order to adapt to the times, which I think you can't do as easily in golf, or you can't do as easily in football, for example, which has helped Formula One adapt where other sports might have not done so, and had these
mhm,
big counter sports come up. A counter opinion to that is that there isn't much choice with Formula One. Because it's so expensive and so ingrained, you can't really just show up and say, "Oh, we're going to do our own Formula One separately,"
mhm,
because you need to hire out Formula One ready circuits, which there aren't that many that exist out there. You need to have I mean, you can only make money with Formula One if you're already investing hundreds and hundreds of millions. So from that perspective, I think just because of the heavy asset management of it, it's not something you can necessarily counter. But the upside is that there is that balance where the teams can say, "Oh, we want to do this," and the Formula One has to kind of do it. The power balance is more balanced in Formula One than it might be in other sports. Sometimes even too balanced towards the teams. Some of the teams have so much power that they can, they can personally say, for example, Ferrari, if they want to leave the sport, that would probably have a huge impact on Formula One, and they have so much power in the way that they can weigh it.
okay.
On the contrary, the one big thing that Formula One isn't advancing on, at least hasn't in the past or has tried but not very well, is on the sort of environmental aspect of it and sustainability.
Mhm,
It's a bunch of cars driving around in circles for fun. Like that's what it is. So obviously it's not a good idea. But more than that, and I'm pretty sure I don't know the numbers, but 90% easily of the emissions don't happen on the weekend. They happen in the logistics.
mhm,
There's a YouTube video called "The Logistics of Formula One," which is worth a watch because each team has multiple paddocks, multiple of their buildings, set up buildings, going around the world at any time on a boat. People are being flown from Qatar to Canada for different weekends. The way it's organized is based around money, not around sustainability. So the calendar is insane. It makes no sense. Sometimes they'll have to travel from Canada to Azerbaijan to whatever Brazil in 3 weeks. And you're like, what the hell are we doing this? Why don't we just do everything in Europe and then do everything in Asia and everything? You know what I mean? It's not
mhm,
really well set up in that term of perspective. And what came up as a counter to that was Formula E. So Formula E is the electric formula, which
Okay.
started about 10 years ago now, as well as some other racing series like Moto E, I think. I don't remember what it's called. It's a sort of Extreme E. It's called Extreme E, which is really targeted towards sustainability. And those are very interesting. They're not as popular and they're not as good at what they do, but they do force Formula One a little bit into a corner and going, maybe we should start thinking about these things because otherwise we're going to be obsolete in some years. So I think it's nice to have this balance of internal dynamics and also external. And I really hope that in the future Formula One gets a bit better at it because I think they have the choice to either make the sport more entertaining and make more money, or try to also weave in some sustainability and some future long proofing. At the moment, they're really leaning towards entertainment. So I
Mhm.
hope that when they come in with the new regulations in 3.5 years, that they really are targeting the long-term future of the sport rather than just, this explosion of money and entertainment that's been happening over the last 3 years.
Yeah. I'm glad you talked about that because I remember I think even at our business school, yesterday business school, we had a case that was talking about operations, and that came up. The F1 operational thing came up as a topic, because of that. They break down and they move and they move and they move. Um, so yeah, that was a good point that you raised. Are there anything else that we should, I guess, know about some of these struggles?
For me, it's just this balance between entertainment, which since now Formula One this decade is making way more money than it used to in the previous decade, probably thanks to Netflix and the explosion that's come with that.
Mm.
I just hope that it balances itself well and doesn't sort of burn too bright and then die rather than aim for the slightly more long-term side of things.
Yeah.
But overall, no, I mean, I like it now as much as I did when I started 7 or 8 years ago. So
Yeah.
overall, it's pretty good.
Well, that is a perfect segue for us to shift a little bit from, more of the information about Formula One and maybe to hear about you and Formula One.
Ah, right. Okay.
So tell us, how you got into looking at Formula One. Like why is it a sport that you love and you are so passionate about?
I don't know. I think most people don't know why they love things sometimes. I could probably give you descriptors, but I'm not sure it would really explain it.
Okay.
I watched a race once in like 2017 with a friend, and I thought it was the best thing I'd ever seen. I was like, oh, I never watched much sports. My family doesn't watch any sport whatsoever. They don't care about sports, at least not in the sort of traditional sense. We just do sports for exercise, effectively.
Yeah.
So I never had that in my life. And then I saw this, and I was like, this is happening, like this with all these players and all these moving parts and these all this politics and this gossip and all these layers of things that happen. And I got really into it from the first race, pretty much. Um, and I told my friend, and he was like, "That was probably the most boring race I've ever seen in my life." And I was like, "Amazing! It can only go uphill from here. This was so terrible. It can only be better." And to be fair, it was extremely boring. Uh, Formula One back 4 years, 5 years ago was very boring. You would just sit down, and it would be the same people racing around in circles in their place. So the top drivers would be at the top, the bottom drivers would be at the bottom.
Okay.
Um, but no, I don't know. I guess I liked cars. I guess it always been in the back of my head because I'd always watched some kind of car racing things, and I like the sporting aspect of it. Personally, I really like the driving side. I really like go-karting. I have my own little sim race at home with a wheel and pedals, and I play video games where I drive around in circles.
I
So
like
I
Mario
guess it
Kart.
just. Oh, I'm not talking Mario Kart, Sam. This is more. No, it's the same shit. It's just driving around in circles, but it's just more in depth with paddles and things.
Yeah.
Um, so
Okay.
I guess it just built up, and it had been in the back of my head, and then I saw it, and I was like, this links everything up together, and I really liked it.
Yeah.
And then yeah, that's it. I went to see some races, and it's been good.
Okay. And we talked about earlier on, we were talking about, that they go to multiple different places. So there are all these
Yeah.
places, all these tracks. You know, everyone I know, they want to go to Monaco. At least my partner, he wants to go to Monaco to watch a game there from a yacht. That is that, that illusion that comes with the game, right? That type of
Mm.
I don't know, prestige of the
Yeah.
experience. So I guess for somebody that's such a big fan, do you have any like favorite tracks?
So I think it depends why you like it, right? Because I think a lot of people like to go to Monaco because of the prestige and the excitement that comes with it. But as a pure race, it's terrible. Like it's a really bad race. Um, very little happens. Occasionally someone crashes, but you probably won't see it.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm not judging your partner at all. Like I also wanted to go and I went and I had a good time. So I'm not like it's also very good. Um, but I also think that's what you get out of the sport, right? In the same way that you go to a football stadium because not because you necessarily care about someone putting a ball in a hole, but because you think it's everyone's cheering and it's vibe and it's this whole ambiance that comes with it.
Mhm.
And the same reason you go to a Grand Prix weekend, and they're doing quite a good job nowadays of building that up a lot more. So they'll put more other people racing in between Formula One, so you don't just have to wait 3 days to sit watching a Formula One race. There'll be other things happening. There'll be a bit of a festival behind it. There'll be things that get built up. Where I would love to go, I would love to go to Japan because Japan is, as always, completely different. I would love to go to Mexico because the weekend typically it's on the same weekend of the Dia de los Muertos, I think. So there's a huge party around it. I would love to go to the one in Texas, I think. In the States. It used to be the only Formula One Grand Prix in the States, but now there's three or four. I don't remember.
No, I know Miami is there. I don't know.
There's Miami, Vegas, Texas, and I think it's three.
Okay.
Regardless, I don't care about Miami or Vegas, but I would love to go to that one because it's a famous circuit. There's a whole ambiance. Everyone's partying. They're like tailgating, which is a thing I've never done in my life. So I'm like, let's go tailgating and eat some
Yeah.
barbecue. It sounds great to me. So those I'd love to go. I'll probably end up going to some in Europe because they're the easiest ones. But occasionally those I would love to go to.
Any favorite driver and or team? And do they belong to each other? I guess.
I don't think I have a favorite team. I think like with other sports, if you have a favorite team, it tends to be because of your family. Um, it's like a tribe, you know.
Hmm.
You'll see Ferrari in Italy is something else to see, or the Verstappen fans in the Netherlands are like a sea of people, and that's really something that you're born within. It's a community type of thing, and because I came through it by myself, I don't have that.
Okay.
I do have favorite drivers, um, just because I think they're nice people. I think Alex Albon, who is really very good at what he does, but also actually seems to be like a nice person. Um, and not obnoxious as well, because some of them seem nice but are still really obnoxious, whereas he actually seems to be relatively normal. I mean, he probably isn't, but he's relatively normal and seems like a nice person. Is someone that I really want to see him do well, just out of sort of, yes, go underdog and do well in your life. And he seems to have tried very hard to stay and race, even though lots of things have kind of come up against him. I mean, he doesn't have much money. He came from a family where his mom has had some issues. His dad has left him. He had to switch his license to race initially for the UK, but then switched to Thai license so that he was able to keep racing. He got kicked out of one team, joined another team. It's like he's always kind of kept fighting and done really well. So from that perspective, I just want to see him do well. And there's equally a couple of other drivers who are the ones that don't necessarily toot their horn so much. Um, I do think you have to mention Lewis and Max. Max because he is absolutely undefeated and like he seems to always be able to just do better than everybody else. He seems on his own league. As much as I dislike him and most of his fans, he's really good. And I think Lewis, I don't click with him. I don't think he's a person I would ever get along with. But I do think him, along with Sebastian Vettel, are doing things for the sport which are a bit more on the sort of ethical, moral side, which a lot of the other drivers don't care about. Like they're really just like, I'm a driver, I drive cars, this is what I do. Whereas Lewis and Seb, who's now left, seem to try to think a bit more holistically about the sport and what that means in terms of the long term and what that means in terms of the planet or the people inside of it. And though I don't click or love them specifically, I think that they're worth highlighting because, you can't just think about racing.
Yeah. Any favorite memory? Like going or watching. I guess I'm kind of hinting to a story that you told us
Yeah, you
on
did. The
campus.
thing is, it's not a favorite memory, but it is the one
Okay.
that comes up.
Okay.
No, because I went to the race in 2021, I think, or 2020, I don't remember. in Spa in Belgium. I think it was 2020. Regardless, um, it was the race that never happened, the official shortest race in Formula One history ever. Um, and what happened is we showed up in Belgium. The Belgium Grand Prix is notoriously badly organized. What you have to know about Formula One is that the circuits run themselves and they just host Formula One for the weekend because the circuits also host lots of other racing. But some of them are not up to scratch, really. They're used to having, 10,000 people on a weekend and then whatever, 100,000 show up and then they have to deal with that. And particularly Spa is in the middle of nowhere in Belgium. And so the roads, the whole infrastructure is just not ready for this many people showing up, even though it's been happening every year for the last 40 years or so. So the whole thing is just bad to start with. You go there, it rains, you park your car on a steep hill in the mud, right? So things are going to go badly anyway. And we happen to have 4 full days of just rain. Not like heavy rain, but that kind of spittle that means that nothing ever dries. And it's very common in that region because the sort of hills there keep all the rain in. So we showed up, we parked, it rained. We went to see some of the practice, it rained. We went back home, tried to wander around, but it was still COVID, so they hadn't any parties or anything like that. It rained, and we were kind of sitting drunk with our wet cans of beer, sad in our wet tents. Whatever. It was Friday. Maybe Saturday would be better because qualifying showing up. Qualifying is going to be good. Qualifying was good, to be fair. It was raining, but when you're watching Formula One, rain is typically a good thing because it mixes things up. You don't know who's going to do what. And it was a great little start to the weekend because it was like, this person's in the lead, even though they shouldn't be there. Some people spun out. Everybody was cheering. It was loads of fun. Um, so from that perspective, it was good fun. But then, getting back to the tent while it's raining and your shoes are still wet and it just hasn't stopped raining for like 3 days straight, it's really tiring. We get back to the tent and we walk around and there's so much mud. Like you see cars stranded with like a foot of mud and they literally can't get their car out. And we start realizing we're not going to get out. Like we have to go to work on Monday. We're not going to get out of this place. So we break open a fence on the side and we drive through it. In the meanwhile, I break my car also because it was my car that I brought, and I hit like a bump and a bit of my car falls off. And I was like, leave it. It doesn't matter. We'll figure it out later on. We get out of there, and my God, did we make a good choice? We get out of there and we park on the side of the road where there's concrete and we should be safe. My car is like at this point covered in mud, half broken, filled with sort of old, wet, smelly socks. But at least we're not in the mud where everybody else is. This is Saturday evening. So Saturday we're sort of totally done with the rain. So we go eat at a proper restaurant and spend way too much money. But at least we got a bit of our socks dry. And we hope that tomorrow, Sunday, the race day, is better. And it's not. The race day sucks. It's like it rains from morning till evening. We get there, the race is delayed 3.5 hours, and then they end up doing is actually driving around the circuit once. And then they go, oh, maybe we can race, maybe we can't race. So they wait, they wait, they wait. And then I think after 5.5 hours waiting in the rain, we just leave because we're like, honestly, there's a time limit to how long a race can be. After like once they start, it can only be 5 or 6 hours and then they have to cancel the race. And it was like 45 minutes to the end of that. And we're like, there's no way they're ever going to race. It's only going to rain more. So we leave. And yeah, by the time we're back in the car, covered in mud, angry and sad, they actually do start the race. But they started behind the safety car. They go around once and then they cancel it. And that was it. So yeah, overall bad weekend. I didn't enjoy it. I won't forget it, annoyingly. And the upside is we got free tickets for the race the year after. We just got lucky. They did like a potluck, and we got great seats and great tickets for the race the year after, which I think was last year, 2022. The downside being that that happened to be the race with, I think, no overtakes. I think it was the only race either in Formula One or that year where there were zero overtakes. So an equally boring race to watch. Um, anyway, go watch Formula One, people. It's great. That happens. That happens. Like the sport is hit and miss. So if you're going there for a weekend, whether it's you or anybody listening, go there for the ambiance and the vibe and the food and the noise. Don't go there expecting to see, the races and everything because you won't understand what's going on anyway. It'll just be
Yeah.
cars flying by you.
Okay. All right. Well, Dimitri, I feel like you gave us a lot of good information, a lot of things I did not know. And for everybody that I interview on the podcast, the one thing that you guys all have in common is that actually so much, like more than I thought I would get from the
Mm.
conversation. I get so much more. So I really appreciate you taking the time to share about something that you love so much. Um I guess before we go, is there anything um that we did not talk about that you want to say to people who are listening to this episode? Or did we cover?
Um, no, not particularly. No, that's
Okay.
okay. I guess thanks for asking. I think it's always nice from a person who cares about something. You tend to forget how much you think about and like to talk about the thing that you care about. So it's nice that you've asked because then, I mean, you asked like 6 questions and I spoke for an hour and a quarter. So in a sense, it's quite nice to be able to talk about it. It's quite a cliche, but it's true. It's nice to think about the things that you like and
Okay.
talk about them. So yeah, thanks. And no, I mean, obviously, yeah, if anybody wants to hear even more about Formula One, feel free to contact me. But I'm sure you've heard plenty enough today.
Yeah, I will tell them how they could find you. But also you shared what I like about our conversation is you actually shared a lot of things that you suggested that people go look at or or watch if they're interested.
Mm,
And so what I will do is I will try to link most of those things that you shared somewhere wherever it's possible. Maybe not on the audio podcast, but maybe under the videos or on the website. So if you're listening to this on audio only, you could go to the website and look for the resources that Dimitri talked about. But is there anything else if they had to start from ground zero, aside from some of
mm.
the videos and stuff you talked about? What would you tell someone to do or to go to get started on that?
For what people might want to start doing, I mean, I don't love it, but I think the Netflix Drive to Survive show is very good at giving you an understanding of what Formula One is. Take it with a very big grain of salt. There's a lot of things in there that are, as with most Netflix dramas, excessively dramatized, and to the extent where they will lie. So it's not. It gives you an understanding. Just don't take it as fact. I do think it's a great way to start. Um, there's so many resources now. Everybody and their brother is doing a Formula One podcast or something on Formula One. I like Josh Revel on YouTube. I think he's good. I think if you're into the technical side, Missed Apex podcast is good. And who's good on YouTube? There's plenty of people on YouTube. We'll go through the specifics, but there's a guy called, I don't remember his name. Okay, I'll have to tell you later.
Yeah.
Um, if not, The Race is also a great podcast for Formula One. But you start with a Netflix. See if it's even remotely interesting to you. Bear in mind it's excessively dramatized, and then try to find a way to watch it without paying too much money because the Formula One contracts are spread between lots of different countries and they tend to overcharge for a lot of the viewing.
Mm,
But you can always pay for the app for a weekend or something and see if you're interested.
okay.
Um, yeah, that's about
All
it.
right.
There's loads out there, so go and have a look.